Well, if you look at the political arena, indeed what you find is that there are these two basic paradigms. One is that host country citizenship is the crown at the end of the integration process, meaning it works as an important incentive for immigrants to integrate. And by itself, however, it doesn't have any further consequences, no further benefits for integration, which also means that if you give immigrants the host country passport too early in the process, you destroy those important incentives to integrate. Right? The second paradigm is what we call this catalyst paradigm. That doesn't ignore that the prospect of receiving host country citizenship can have important incentives, but it means that the passport itself can further catalyze immigrants' integration. And there could be various mechanisms for this. One is that it boosts the motivation of immigrants to integrate, but also, for example, that it reduces discrimination that migrants experience in the labor market. Yeah, identifying the causal effect of citizenship is indeed quite a tricky thing. Because what you don't want to do is compare apples and oranges, by which I mean comparing immigrants that are different on many dimensions, some with and some without a host country passport, and then you claim that any difference you find is due to citizenship. Right? So as always, one could think that the ideal experiment, the gold standard for causal inference, would be a randomized control trial where you randomly hand out passports to some but not to others, and a few years later you collect integration outcomes. And not surprisingly, maybe for a variety of reasons, that's quite tricky to do in many contexts, and often for good reasons. So that's why researchers have turned to so-called natural experiments, where they, for example, exploit a citizenship reform that allows them to compare similar immigrants that maybe arrived a little earlier than others and were affected or not affected by the reform. Or you could also think about comparing people that have taken a citizenship exam and some barely passed and others barely failed, and then you can leverage this. My co-authors and I take a slightly different approach. We focus on the case of Switzerland, where in some municipalities, voters decided in referendums on each individual citizenship application. And if you had 50% or more yes votes in those referendums, you got citizenship. And if you had 49%, you did not. And so focusing on those close referendums, those immigrants who barely passed or barely failed the 50% threshold and got or did not get citizenship, allows us to compare similar immigrants and identify the causal effect of citizenship. Yeah, so what we've done is that we interviewed these immigrants who barely passed or barely failed these citizenship referendums 15 years later on average. And we found along several dimensions of integration that citizenship indeed boosts integration outcomes. So we found that those who barely passed the citizenship referendum feel less discriminated against, are more likely to plan to stay in the host country. They perform better in a political knowledge quiz that we administered, and they also achieve higher earnings. And we were able to link anonymously, of course, the outcome of these citizenship referendums and the vote shares that they received with their pension contributions, from which we could back out their earnings. Importantly, all these benefits of citizenship are most strongly for the more marginalized immigrants. And that suggests that for those immigrants who often experience the highest barriers to successful integration, citizenship has this particularly strong boost. And in essence, that means that citizenship is not only an incentive to integrate, but also a catalyst for further integration. And if we compare this to other integration policies, such as language courses or integration contracts, these are some of the largest effects that we've seen in the field. Just to benchmark it, for example, we find that those who barely passed the referendum during the following 5 to 15 years have earnings that are about 13% higher than those who barely failed. So quite robust and significant effects.